What happened in the first place. Thanks, Mr Speaker.
Good speech.
I call the honourable member Julianne Genter.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I rise to speak on the Land Transport and Road User Charges Legislation Amendment Bill, Part 1. The Green Party is supporting this bill and the principal changes that it's making, which establish an annual charge in lieu of a road user charge for some vehicles that are exempt from road user charges, and create a new regulation making power to exempt from road user charges vehicles that are not required to be registered, is an obvious amendment that was overlooked when the original legislation was passed. The principal legislation was the Road User Charges Act 2012, which was a major overhaul to the road user charges scheme, which was passed in 2012. And the Green Party can support these minor changes. We do think it's unfortunate, but it does happen with overhaul of a system as complex as our road user charges system, that there would be oversights and there would be things to rectify that would come back to this House, and we can understand that. What's important is that it is following the principle of users pay, and so it makes sense that if there are vehicles that are not using the road, that they should not have to pay road user charges. So that makes sense. But there are some missed opportunities, obviously, both with the principal legislation and this Amendment Act, to further rectify anomalies in the legislation. For example, those using light diesel vehicles, which Darian Fenton referred to, those passenger vehicles are actually being charged perhaps a little bit too much, given that they have greater fuel efficiency, and we want to incentivize greater fuel efficiency in our passenger fleet. And road user charges are a way of applying fees in an economically rational way that will incentivize the purchase of vehicles that are going to be more efficient. So that's something that we could have looked at that wasn't looked at. Instead, we just provide an exemption for fast tractors, which are not usually using the road, and exemptions for unregistered vehicles, which is fair enough. One of the things that came about as a result of the principal legislation, the Road User Charges Act 2012, is now the total contribution to the National Land Transport Fund from heavy commercial vehicles using diesel has actually declined significantly, while the contribution from petrol vehicles, passenger vehicles, by and large, has increased. So it used to be closer to a 50-50 split. Now it's getting down to only about a third is coming from these heavy vehicles. And I suppose there is some cause for concern at a time when we're allowing bigger and heavier trucks on the road, which have consequences in terms of road maintenance, of the requirement for ratepayers to invest in stronger bridges and whatnot, that actually there is a bit of a subsidy going on. Road freight, we do want it to be as efficient as possible, and the current system probably isn't getting that outcome. Another consequence, one of the rationale for the changes to the road user charges system was that we could increase compliance and reduce avoidance. So by and large, the contribution from heavy commercial vehicles and trucks has declined, but the argument was that there would be increased compliance. And in fact, from the financial review, we saw that wasn't the case. So there's about the same amount of avoidance of paying of road user charges, from what I can tell from the documents from the Ministry and NZTA, as there was before. But by and large, the road freight industry is paying less in its contribution to our national transport budget. And of course, this can't continue infinitely unless we invest in alternatives to the roads. We're going to have a problem in the future funding the transport budget because this government is got some pretty ambitious plans to spend billions of dollars on just a couple of really expensive motorways that don't actually carry many of our freight ton kilometers or many of our passenger trips. And their decision to spend most of the transport budget on these few motorways, and in particular to debt fund some of them, as they're proposing in the case of Transmission Gully, to be funded from private debt, which means that New Zealanders 20 to 25 years from now, or even 30 years from now, will still be paying back the money that was spent by this national government on one motorway that carries, a tiny percentage, less than 1% of all vehicle trips in New Zealand. That's not a rational use of our transport budget, but what's concerning is that we've seen that vehicle kilometres travelled on our road network have declined over the past, they've sort of stalled since 2006, Mr. Chair.
I call the honourable member Julianne Genter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So vehicle kilometres travelled particularly by passenger vehicles, have declined per capita. They've stagnated overall, and this is a phenomenon that's been observed in other comparable countries to New Zealand, Australia, the United States, Canada. All other OECD countries really are seeing the same peak vehicle use. And because of that, we're having less revenue coming into the National Land Transport Fund than we anticipated. So over time, we're going to have a serious funding shortfall between what the government wants to spend on very expensive motorways, what the government needs to spend to maintain our existing road network at a high standard and ensure that it's safe, and the amount of money that we actually have coming in from petrol tax and road user charges. And what is inevitably going to happen if the government doesn't reprioritize its spend and cut some of the more superfluous spending and hopefully not take on this additional billions of dollars worth of debt to fund one particular project which has a very poor business case, what is going to happen is that future governments are going to have to put up road user charges and petrol tax. It's ironic that at a time when there's declining demand for our road network, that we're spending so much money on new redundant projects, which are going to put us into debt, and then which we are going to have to raise money afterwards and charge people even more for the use of the roads while they're using them less. This isn't a rational policy outcome, in my opinion. So while the Green Party is happy to support this bill, we think that New Zealanders need to be aware that in the future we're going to be seeing increases to petrol tax and increases to road user charges to fund this national government's outrageous plans to spend billions on a few very low-value motorways. And it's going to be bad for the country, and it's going to be bad for road users most of all. And I've said this, to the Road Transport Forum. I've said it to the AAA. This current government isn't spending the petrol tax dollars and the road user charges money in a way that is best for road users. And that is something that I think has been very easy for the government to make the claim that because they're spending money on roads that it's good for road users. But if we take a rational analysis of it, take an objective look at where the money's going, what the benefit's going to be, whether or not it's actually going to benefit freight or road users, and the answer is it's really not, because in the future we could have higher petrol prices, higher diesel prices, and at the same time, while people are looking for alternatives to the road so that we can move our freight at a lower cost, avoid those high petrol tax, the high cost of diesel. And while passengers are looking for an alternative to sitting in traffic in Auckland, for example, because they need to get to work and there's not been the investment in the passenger rail network that was needed, they're at the same time going to have to be spending even more because we'll be paying back the debt on Transmission Gully. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chair.
I call the honourable member Dennis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. New Zealand First has expressed